But I'd like to hand over to my colleague and a really excellent activist and comrade from Liverpool, Peter Bulmer. Over to you, Peter.
Thanks very much, Deepa. Brilliant first session, very inspiring and a lot to take in. I think somebody said an hour wasn't enough. You're right, we need to do more of these meetings, definitely. But for the second section now, what we're going to talk about is how we organise and build the fight back. It's really important, obviously, that we make sure we resist what's been going on. So we've got a variety of speakers who are going to address this question, and then there'll be more time after that for discussion, so people can put their hands up and speak there. So I'll just remind people, we're going to record the main speakers, but we won't record the discussion, so you are free to say whatever you want, don't worry about that. And our first speaker will be Tim Wilson, who is UCU National Disputes Committee member and also Vice Chair of Dundee UCU. For the participants, if you haven't already done it, pop your branch name in your Zoom name so we can see where people are from. It's good to get an idea of that, but I'll hand over to Tim now. Thanks very much. Cheers.
Thanks, Peter. I think it was a great first session. And the thing that struck me most about the session was the issues of equality and the impact this has on pensions. And I think it's important to recognize that the union and a defined benefits pension has very strong similarities. A union is all focused around dignity at work, and pension is about dignity in retirement. And both our union and a defined benefits pension is founded on the principle that a collective action makes us stronger and safer and more secure. And that is why I think it's absolutely important that the union fights till the very last breath to maintain the collective nature of our pension. It's stronger for everybody. Now, I want to focus for the rest of the few minutes I have on reasons to be positive. Back in 2018, the employers told us there is no alternative, we're closing the scheme. And they closed the scheme. And it was our industrial action that forced them to reopen it. And it wasn't the fact that we went on strike that actually ultimately got progress. What really got the progress was the threat of further industrial action extending into the exam period. And I think that needs to be borne in mind for the current discussions. But since then, it's been incredibly frustrating time. And I'm sure everyone shares my frustration that we seem to be back in a worse position now than we were 3 years ago. But we do need to know that underneath that extreme offer from USS, there's been plenty of progress elsewhere. 3 years ago, the employers were certain there was problems in USS. Whereas last year, they participated very constructively in the valuation discussion forum with UCU, making the case that the scheme was fundable and under the existing rates. We've had politicians interested in the Work and Pension Secretary. They've hauled TPR over the coals over the last few years. And even TPR has had to acknowledge our existence. 3 years ago, they didn't want to meet us. Now they put out, 17 points in a frequently asked questions thing. They didn't ask the right questions because they got to frame them, but they're still paying attention to us and they feel the need to be seen. These are all elements of progress, not as much as we'd like, but it's illustrative of how the debate has shifted over the last 3 years. And the principal reason that the debate has shifted is because people within UCU have continually engaged with USS and made intellectual arguments that there is an alternative to the neoliberal strategy that's been pushed so hard by TPR and USS. And we've pretty much won that argument. Every time an error is found or an alternative is presented, USS shifts the goalposts. They've really delivered a masterclass in the last 3 years of just how many ways you can manipulate a defined benefits valuation to get the result you want. And we've had to continually engage in the process in order to knock down their arguments and shift the arguments forward. And so we're now left with the extreme example you saw that Sam presented us, where they're predicting essentially no growth in assets for the next 80 years. Everyone knows that's absurd. And it is so absurd that it leaves them even more open than they were before to accusations of breach of trust, etc. Then makes the arguments for legal action against them, I think, stronger. And this is something the union really needs to consider in the next few months. I'll sum up, right? I was going to say there's just one other point that needs to be made, and that is the intellectual arguments and the legal action will mean nothing unless we have the threat of further strong industrial action. And I will stop there.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for keeping to time and speaking so well. I absolutely agree with you completely. Our next speaker is going to be Carlo Morelli. I think many people have already seen Carlo. He's UCU Scotland president and he knows his stuff about pensions. Over to you, Carlo.
Thanks, Peter, and thanks, everybody. This has been a really interesting discussion. Can I just ask people in the audience and everyone, we need these debates to go into the branches and we need meetings in the branches to start discussing pensions and what we do. So inviting speakers and you all speaking in your branches about the threat to pensions is crucial to mobilising the next layer of activists and members around the issue of pensions. I want to say a few words though about the 2018 strikes and what led up to. I was a UCU negotiator for USS at the time. If you think back to then, we originally had 61 branches voted for strike action, which after reballoting some, we got to 64. That led to the biggest strikes in higher education we'd ever seen at that point, 14 days of strike action. As everyone knows, we saved the scheme as a result of that. One of the reasons for that was the scale of the cuts, just like they are now, in terms of what people would lose, but also the threat to the casualised, the most vulnerable, those on lowest pay in the scheme, just as they are now. And it also threatened the actual existence of the scheme, just as this does now. And here I want to raise something that's not been raised yet, and that is the dangers of moving from one scheme into another. Because if the defined benefit scheme closes for good, for new entrants, the scheme becomes cash flow negative. In other words, in order to pay the pensions, the assets have to be sold off. And the moment that process starts, the scheme becomes unviable and unstable, because in the selling off of the assets, the so-called deficit that they talk about then starts to be materialized. And so the transition from one scheme into another is massively problematic, both in terms of the fact that people lose out on pensions if they're not in the old scheme, but even those in the old scheme now face a problem of whether or not their pensions will be payable in the long term. Certainly for those who have years in the scheme, but even I want to extend this to those who are current pensioners. They should be protected because the assets should be paying their pensions, and they should be protected because of the Pension Protection Fund. The problem is that in a deficit the scale that they are talking about creating, and it would be created, the Pension Protection Fund would be no help whatsoever. It will be dwarfed. So we will be in a completely unknown environment in terms of what would happen in the future if the defined benefit scheme closes. What's different this time is they're not talking about closing the scheme, but they're talking about making it so unattractive that members themselves will remove themselves from the scheme. So by default, we'll get the same process taking place. So this is a real issue about how the pension scheme remains viable in the future. And central to that is that it's cash flow positive, that it's open to new entrants, and it remains an immature scheme. That is crucial to the success of the defined benefit scheme that we've got now. I want to finish up on a couple of points. One, I think it was Gareth in the first session asked, why on earth are they doing this and with these ludicrous valuations? There was a central point that's not been discussed again this time around, but lies behind this, and that was something called segmentation. And the segmentation of the scheme. The employers were very keen, and these are the bigger employers particularly, are very, very keen to break apart the collective governance. And Deepa mentioned the security that collective governance of covenant in the scheme provides, where is a mutual agreement to ensure pensions are paid. In 2017 and 18, there was an attempt, one of the motivations was to destroy the collective covenant and segment, i.e. separate off all of the liabilities into the individual institutions. That was driven by the employers, and it was driven because the marketisation of higher education meant that in a marketised, privatised higher education system, there were winners and losers. And if you're the winner, you're fine. If you're the loser, the winner doesn't want to pick up the tab of the bankruptcy. So the segmentation of the scheme was a key driver in 2018. And I want to argue it's still now. It's not, they're silent on this, but it's clear that the big employers also recognise the segmentation, the breaking up of the covenant is important. I'll finish up on just one point then now. What do? We do need industrial action. We do need to ensure that members are prepared to take industrial action. That backs up all the points that people have made before. And if we do that, we've got power in this and we've got control and influence in the negotiations. I'll leave it there. Thanks very much.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Carla. I absolutely agree. But I'm not going to keep going on. So look, we've got our next speaker. I'm really pleased to introduce Joss from Heriot-Watt, Vice President of the branch there. You set excellent voting targets for other branches in dispute who want to get the vote out. And it certainly inspired Liverpool University, where we've just done the same kind of thing. So over to Joss from Heriot-Watt. Thanks very much.
Hi, thanks, Peter. And yeah, congratulations to Liverpool. I'm in my full campaign Get Out, as you can see. So what we need to do for USS, first of all, we need to engage members, and they need to know why this matters to them. And they need to get that in simple terms. It was easier in 2017, 2018, because we could say they're taking away your DB pension. Now employers are trying to be slightly more seductive. We're on the same side as you. We want the same things. They say this in meetings all the time. We agree with you, GU. We want to maintain an element of defined benefit. We don't want an element of defined benefit. We want the pension that we were offered when we signed up for our jobs. So we need clear messaging that tells members what the direct effect is on their wages, their deferred wages, and their total remuneration. So if you pay more, your wage packet goes down. If you get your accruals down, you have to work for longer and you get less pension. And your employer counts the amount that they pay into your pension as part of your total remuneration. If that is being diverted into deficit recovery, your total remuneration from your employer has gone down. So in short, you're going to pay more, or you're going to get less, or possibly you're going to pay more and get less. We need to use figures like the 12% that the cut in accrual represents, or the 21% overall that Mike Otsuka has come out with for the scheme. Get those short messages out to people, because although we are a very intelligent union, not everyone has time to get into the details. They need to be engaged with the real, what's in this for them. We may also need to do some basics on why, in the face of these clearly nonsensical figures from USS, DC is not a better option, because I was at a meeting the other day and staff who are not in the union or not up on pensions are saying, well, why don't we just have a DC scheme? We need to get the argument on that it's not good. And we need to get the message out to the public. We're not asking for taxpayers' money. We're asking for the scheme that we give a lot of our money to look after our money properly and to look after us. That's what they're there for. So you need to hold members' meetings, include non-members of your institution if you can, because we represent all scheme members and the employers are surveying them. They will ask those people questions too. And if they don't know, they'll likely opt for things like a DC scheme and a two-tier scheme, thinking it seems like a good idea. So we need these short, sharp messages. Pay more, get less, DC is not the solution. And we need to look at the way that branches like Brighton in their recent action have done a fantastic job of making resources, posters you can hold up in meetings, things you can put on Twitter, on Facebook, and get all these messages out so that people can see them. We also need to be very clear about what we hope to gain from strike action. Now, this needs to be decided within proper forums within UCU and then communicated clearly. And it needs to be things that our negotiators can actually work with. The employers always tell us that we need to be flexible. Everyone needs to be flexible, but it's always us that has to bend over backwards. So we need to get a clear message as to what we're wanting from our employers. So that's the why. Now, how? Local consultation. If you've got local consultation, try to get to this survey that UUK have put out, try to get it changed. If you can't get it changed, make sure members know that the answers to the questions that they should be giving that don't give the employer carte blanche to set up a DC scheme. Push your employer to act. Neil's already covered the law. There are all kinds of legal action that we can take, and we need to do that. There's political action. There are political people who are on our side on this, and you need to get your local politicians on side, because it's not just our pension, it's everybody's pensions if they muck this up. And it has an effect on the economy and the taxpayer as well. So underpinning all of this, though, there has to be a credible threat of industrial action. We can argue, we can talk all we like. At the end of the day, we're a union and our industrial might lies in withdrawing our labour. That brings me to organising in a pandemic. It is possible. Many branches have managed it, starting with us at Heriot-Watt, recently Liverpool. In fact, in some ways, it's a bit easier in a pandemic because you know where people are going to be. They're not going to be abroad. You can get meetings organised over Zoom. Instead of knocking on somebody's door or slipping a wee note under it, you can have a wee chat with them in Teams. And the ballots go to people's houses rather than to their workplaces. If you want to organise a GTBO, whether that's locally or for a national campaign, do get in touch with Heriot-Watt. We love to talk GTBO, particularly James Richard, who is the architect of our scheme. So to summarise, we need to make it clear to members why they need to act. We need to let them know how we're going to act. And mostly, we need a mandate for industrial action. Strong industrial action is what brings the employers to the table. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for that. I do feel really inspired and moved by this, so thank you for that. Okay, look, our next speaker is going to be the final one from the front of the room for this session. So the speaker will be Megan Povic, who is on the National Disputes Committee and also is in Leeds UCU and also represents women and LGBT plus people on the standing committee. So I'm going to hand over to Megan, but what I would say is if you think about making a contribution, you want to ask a question or something, get your hand up while Megan's speaking, so we've got plenty of people for the next bit. So over to you, Megan, if you're ready. Megan, are you able to speak?
Yeah.
Go.
Hi, thank you, Peter. Usual introduction to Zoom. Can you hear me? Yeah.
We hear you.
Brilliant. Okay. What I want to talk about is a big picture that the attacks on our pension scheme is part of. And this big picture is the political idea, neoliberal idea, private greed, not public need. And this began with Thatcher and her acolyte, Tony Blair, and is being put into practice by Johnson and Starmer. The attacks on our DB scheme began in 2011, actually, led by our employers. And it was no coincidence that this kind of fitted hand in glove with these neoliberal ideas. In 2018, neoliberalism was crystallized into actuarial standards in the financial reporting standards, which were introduced throughout the EU then. And these standards underpin the conservatism of the USS trustees and TPR. And they're part of the answer to why these mad valuations are taking place. The international context was the IMF, the EU and World Bank enforcing fire sales of public assets to private companies. And finally, we need to be aware that HE in the UK is a fast-growing section of the UK economy and a prime target for private providers such as Pearson. Our employers want the pension risk off their books, and that means an end to DB as far as they're concerned. But no private company will buy a university if they also have to commit to the risk that the pension scheme defaults. And finally, as a contribution in the previous part of this meeting said, the removal of financial guarantees in the Higher Education Act of 2017 have increased employer sensitivity to the pension risk. In terms of our strategy, we really need to unite with other unions whose pensions will be under threat if our defined benefit scheme is destroyed. And there was a very good meeting last week, with some NEU representatives. But I think in general political terms and in terms of a political argument, the argument has to be for collective provision of pensions. and the pension income is what matters. The private provision of pensions is bad for employers. It increases management fees, leaves us open to plundering of savings by sitting managers, and opens the door for the privatization of higher education. So by defending our pensions, we are defending public education. And this political dimension is very, very important when we're seeking support from students and their parents and the public in general, that the destruction of USS will open the door for wholesale privatization of higher education. We need a political campaign for collective provision and against private provision. We need to join that to an argument for an end to student fees and free public provision of higher education. Finally, we should be campaigning to end the DC scheme. It undermines the DB part, as was pointed out by Carlo. It actually threatens the whole scheme, the movement to DC. So, and finally, DC is inequitable. So to conclude, it is essential that a serious threat of industrial action underpins everything else we do. This isn't an argument about political campaigning, legal, and everything else. We need all of that. But without the threat, a real threat of strike, and as been pointed out, we needed that strike action to save the DB part of our scheme. First and foremost, our employers have to know that we will strike to defend our pensions. Without that threat, we can say goodbye to our pensions and hello to privatized higher education. End.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for finishing that session really, really well. We've got several people who've got their hands up and would like to speak. Before we bring those in, can I just ask our Manchester occupiers to speak? So we're joined today by students who've gone into Oxford to sort of finish off and sum up. Can I just remind people, we are going to need to be really organised and fight to sort out our fight back over this. So please do try and come to the Wednesday social UCU Solidarity Movement meetings. I'll post the link in the chat in a second. It's important that we build up our forces because we're going to have to fight over this. So I'll put the link in and over to Roddy to sort of finish up. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Peter, and thanks a lot to everybody for what has really been a fantastically informing and informative and very motivational meeting. The phrase I'm going to take away from this is cartoonishly evil. What a brilliant way of putting it, Gareth. I think it's absolutely fantastic. But the punchline is, it is actually all too real what's happening. And I think that's the really important thing to get across. Lots of members don't know the scale of the offensive that's actually taken place here. And I think it's really important that people take away some of the complexities that have been highlighted here today. But the other factor is, of course, it's not overall complicated. They are out to rob us on a massive, massive scale. And what was said about segmentation, you think about what's happening, or what was happening, I should say, with the European Super League is exactly the same thing. Market madness, the big fish get bigger, eating the smaller fish, letting the weaker clubs go to the wall. Well, that's exactly what they want to do with higher education. But JP Morgan has to be one of the biggest banks in the world. JP Morgan was absolutely humbled, and we can humble USS. I say, sack the board. A lovely slogan going up and down the country, and football clubs up and down the country right now. I think that's absolutely applicable to the people that are trying to ram this down our throats. It's totally and utterly unacceptable, but it's completely and utterly winnable. And I think that therefore the key thing here, people need to take this back to the branches and win people round to the need to build a campaign. Everybody that's been at this conference will have takeaways of their own, and we need to make sure that all the different talents that we've heard here today, all the different insights that we've heard are brought to bear in building a campaign in the here and now that can start to turn this around and make sure that we're in the shape for the new academic year for a fight that is actually going to defeat USS and put defined contributions into the dustbin of history, along with JP Morgan's attempts to smash up the football, we can actually make sure that the same thing happens with their attempts to smash up higher education. And education is a public good, a public service, is what's at risk here. And our pension scheme, if this takes place, then it means that every single workplace pension scheme is at risk too. So what matters is that we defeat this scheme and provide inspiration to other people of the ability of a united, strong, growing union to be able to take this fight forward. So I'd appeal to everybody, please make sure that your branch is meeting soon. Make sure you've got delegates at the meeting on Monday. Make sure that the National Union starts to take these kind of initiatives. It really shouldn't be down to a few activists and individual branches to build meetings like this. If our National Union had done it, it would be much, much bigger, with much more resources. And I think that this is the kind of thing, a vision of what's possible in terms of building a union that can start to provide an example to the trade union movement of what's possible, just as we did in 2018, just as we did in showing that our union can be built by rank and file action and by democracy at the bottom, building for the kind of leadership and the kind of a union that we need to see. Thanks, everybody, enormously.
Thanks very much, Roddy. Thanks, everybody, for participating today. It's been an excellent session, and I appreciate it. I won't repeat what Roddy said. We know what we've got to do when we go back to our branches. So let's do that and get on fighting. I want to fight before they make me redundant again, so come on, let's do it. Thanks very much, everybody. You're welcome to unmute and stuff now if you wish to.